I'm Selena Colburn, and I represent the Chittenden 6-4 district here in Burlington in the Vermont House, and I'm the clerk of the Climate Caucus. And there are so many legislators and Climate Caucus members here. Maybe if you all could just stand so we don't miss you, and just do a quick introduction. Do you want to just quickly say who you are and go around the room, starting with you, Jessica?
Sure. Jessica Brumstead, and I'm from Shelburne and St. George, which is Chittenden 5-2.
Carol Odie. I represent the far north end of Burlington, District 6-1. I'm on the Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee.
Brian Chena, Chittenden 6-4, Burlington, the Old North End and the East End and the Hill, and I'm on the House Healthcare Committee.
Chris Pearson, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Climate Caucus, senator from here in Chittenden County.
Mary Sullivan, state rep from this district here. I'm the immediate past co-chair of this Climate Caucus.
Jean O'Sullivan, I represent District 6-2, which is the old and new North End, and I'm vice chair of House Commerce.
Bill Lippert, state representative from Heinsberg.
So I think we got everybody, right? I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Climate Solutions Caucus in the legislature. So in the legislature, we have some issues-based caucuses and some party-based caucuses. And the Climate Solutions Caucus was founded in 2012 by Chris Pearson and others. And it's actually quickly become the largest issues-based caucus in the legislature. So we now have close to half the Vermont legislature are members of the Climate Caucus. And I think that's really because of a lot of you who care passionately about this issue. I've seen over the summer more interest from legislators in joining the Climate Caucus, particularly after things like the climate strike, and people are really getting the message from their constituents that this is an issue they need to be engaged on. So we meet weekly on Thursdays over the lunch hour in the legislature. It's an open meeting. Anyone is welcome to come and join us. We do try to use those meetings increasingly to really roll up our sleeves and get together and work on actually passing legislation.
Where?
Oh, we're in the State House. We're often in room 10, but you can just ask the Sergeant at Arms where the Climate Caucus is meeting, and you can look at, there's posted schedules for the State House posted online. So last year we did some things in the legislature on climate. I think some of us wished we could have done even more, so we made some investments in incentives around electric vehicles. We were able to get some increased funding for weatherization and a study to look at how to further our weatherization efforts in Vermont, and a lot of other things. But we knew as a caucus that we wanted to go into this session with even more focus and preparation. So we actually, within a week of adjournment or so, got together and held a retreat for the Climate Solutions Caucus and started to talk about what we wanted to work on and what we wanted to put forward as legislation in the 2020 session. And we broke into really 3 main working groups. So we had a group looking at issues around transportation. We had a group that Brian chaired that was looking at issues around a green economy. And then we had a group looking at building efficiency for the state. And each of these groups brought forward some proposals that we're now really in the process of developing into legislation, drafting into bills that will be introduced in the 2020 session. And we also have a bill that many of us were working on last session called the Global Warming Solutions Act that you'll hear about in a minute, that was a piece of already existing piece of legislation that there was a lot of interest in continuing to push for in the coming session. So really tonight we're going to hear in a little more detail about what some of those proposals are, but the idea is that we're here to have a conversation with all of you, to hear your feedback, to answer your questions. And I think, we're trying to walk a very fine line here where we know that we need to act on climate, we know that we need to act boldly on climate, and we also know the reality of the Vermont legislature as a part-time, 4-month legislature, so we're trying to also come up with a platform that we feel like is actionable in that period with the leadership and the votes that we have in the legislature. So I hope you'll tell us where we need to be bolder, and I hope you'll also help us fine-tune these proposals and tell us what you think.
Great. Thank you, Selena. So I'm Chris Pearson. I am one of your senators right here in Chittenden County. I live in Burlington, and it's great to see this big a crowd out. We had one of these last night, 60 people in Bristol. So per capita, I think Bristol's winning, but this is an impressive group for sure. And I want to say this is the 14th or 15th such meeting we've had, discussion around the state. I haven't been at all of them. Sarah Copeland-Hansis, who's the co-chair of the Climate Caucus, Climate Solutions Caucus, she lives in Bradford on the eastern part of the state. She and I have been splitting this up with a bunch of legislators who've been active. So Selena mentioned our process this summer. We've formed these working groups. We got legislators to put ideas together, and then Sarah and I said, everybody send your ideas, and we'll see if we can come up with a consensus agenda. We had a couple of goals. One was, as Selena said, things that we can achieve in 4.5 months, but that would also be significant. We need to do that obviously for the climate, but also we need to do that because legislators need to see that it's good politics to be aggressive on climate, right? We need to sort of change the dialogue. That has been changing, particularly this year in the activism world. The largest the climate strike was the largest event I've been to, rally in my many years living in Burlington, and you're seeing some of that change. But we needed to gather an agenda that would be achievable and significant. And I will tell you, legislators are not shy about ideas. We ended up having about 30 pages of ideas come together, and that was no small challenge to boil that down. But we tried to boil it down into 4 main areas. And of course, we're also driven by the basic principle that when you take steps in climate, combating the climate crisis, when we address the emergency successfully, we will also strengthen our economy, particularly our local economy, because so many of the solutions are a relocalization of things. That's very obvious when you look at fossil fuels. 100% of our fossil fuels are imported in Vermont. When we can transition away from fossil fuels into clean, green electricity that we develop and create right here in Vermont, we're stopping that exodus of funds. So these are some of the themes that we were hitting. And we tried to come up with, we centered on 4 areas. Transportation. Transportation is the single biggest driver of emissions in Vermont. It is the fastest growing sector of our emissions. So transportation is clearly important. Building efficiency is also very important. It's the second biggest driver of our emissions. Our old leaky houses, we've talked about that a lot here in Burlington. The net zero goals center a lot around buttoning up our buildings. So building efficiency. We have been in the legislature for many years investing millions of dollars into weatherizing homes, but we are far behind targets there. This is a very good example of the marriage between good climate solutions and jobs and strengthening the economy. So building efficiency. Number 3 was energy and energy efficiency. And lastly, 4th is accountability. This is the platform we want to talk to you about tonight. This is by no means the only thing, these 4 items, and we'll get into them, the only thing that the Climate Solutions Caucus is looking at, but these are kind of what we call our banner bills. These are the big priorities that we are trying to push. They are not a slam dunk by any stretch, but we do think they meet the goal of being significant and achievable. So I'll just take them one at a time. Transportation. How many people here have heard of RGGI? Wow. Is that because we're in BED? Are you guys all studying up? RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This was started by Jim Douglas when he was the governor, signed us up to RGGI. It is partnered, I believe, 9 states at the moment, and it is a cap and invest system around our electric production in the whole region. It has been very successful. Most Vermonters are not aware of it. It's sort of below the radar, and it has done a couple of things. It has been responsible for closing a lot of coal plants and actually oil electric producing plants in the region. And in Vermont, because we haven't had so many of those dirty producers, it has allowed us to be the beneficiaries, and we've had money coming into the state to help us make investments actually through Efficiency Vermont. So it has in fact kept our electric rates low in Vermont, and it has been very successful. The region, in terms of emissions coming out of the energy production sector, has been declining. You know, not nearly enough, but it has been a successful model. So again, another theme I would say is we're trying to build on things that we've been doing that are successful and they're proven. So building on RGGI is something called the Transportation Climate Initiative, TCI. This is actually bigger than RGGI. It's currently involving 12 states from Maine over to New York and down to Virginia and everyone in between. So there's some pretty significant states, in addition to Vermont, there's some pretty significant states in there when you have New York's economy and Pennsylvania's economy, Virginia's economy, Massachusetts, Connecticut. This is some heavyweight players here, and if added up together, it's a very significant chunk of the country's economy. And the idea is, in the transportation sector, a similar strategy of a cap and invest system, which would have money coming into Vermont. People remind me it's off budget, meaning it's not coming out of our tax dollars. Money coming into Vermont that allows us to have investments in sustainable alternative transportation. This is a big one for us because we're such a rural state. People have to drive a long way to get to work, and it's been a tough one for us to crack because you can't realistically and efficiently send buses up through the Northeast Kingdom, for an example. So TCI has a lot of promise. The details are very sketchy. Because they're not public yet. I don't think they're finalized by any stretch. In the next few weeks, the anticipation is the 12 governors will have an announcement, an update. As you can imagine, wrestling 12 states to come up with an agreement is no small task. But the legislature is hoping we can receive that announcement and do our part, which would be enabling Vermont to participate in TCI. And then also, importantly, the Climate Solutions Caucus wants to make sure we put some parameters around this money. So as people probably know, we already have budget deficits in our roads and our bridge budgets. We don't want to use the TCI money to backfill those gaps. We want to make sure this money is secured for sustainable alternative investments. Another thing that we're looking at, which I think holds a lot of promise, an idea that came out of Massachusetts, Governor Baker's looking at, is the idea of, because this is anticipated to have predictable revenue coming into the state, there's an opportunity for what's called a revenue bond. And climate investments do well. So many of the challenges around getting our hands around the climate crisis is because of money, right? And many of the solutions involve upfront investments. And part of the reason for that is, think about it this way. If you take a diesel bus off the road and you replace it with an electric bus, you win right away. You've reduced emissions immediately. You also win next year, and you win next year, and you win the year after that, and the year after that. And so if we can harness this predictable revenue into a bond, we could potentially jumpstart our investments in Vermont. It's to me, it's an exciting premise. Now, there could well be a delay because wrestling 12 states to get on board is not going to be simple. So we're definitely exploring more short-term and investments and immediate policy changes and building on our charging stations and electric vehicle incentives that we've been working on. But TCI, I think, is the framework that moving years into the future is very promising for Vermont, and of course has an enormous benefit. I would assume we all agree, better to be working with 12 states than to have little Vermont trying to go it alone on something like this. So TCI is one of our focus around transportation. Building efficiency. For years we've, as I said, been investing in the neighborhood of $10 to $12 million into weatherizing our homes. This has been centered at low-income households. It's wildly successful. We've saved people money when we make these investments. These are creating good jobs, but we are not able to keep pace. There's a big backlog on people that want to take advantage of that. This past year, we increased the investment in weatherizing by about 50%, and we also pulled it out of only low-income families, which actually stretches the investment dollars much further and allows middle-income families to take advantage of their programs. So we're going to keep doing that, and we're going to keep arguing for more money to go into that. But along the way, we've noticed a few things that came out of the working groups this summer. One is Vermont has effective building codes when it comes to energy. We have aggressive building codes. When they built this building, of course, in Burlington you have city codes, but if you build a significant building, a large building, anywhere in the state, you're living up to those codes because there are engineers involved and they have their license on the line. Electricians and so on. All these professionals have to honor the code because otherwise their license can be removed and they can't work. The joke is those same standards apply to homes, but the joke is that they're voluntary. Part of the reason is we don't have the resources to run enforcement all over the state. And part of it is as simple as this. There's no home for code enforcement, essentially, in state government. So we want to explore that, start to figure out who's going to own this challenge. We've also, I think, uncovered something. It's sort of basic, but has the potential to have real impact. Every day in Vermont, thousands of us intersect with professionals in our home. If they're realtors, real estate appraisers, they're HVAC contractors, they're electricians, so on and so forth. These are folks that help us make investment decisions if you're replacing your furnace. These are also professionals who are licensed by the state. Every 2 years they come and apply, and in order to do business in Vermont they have to have a license. That's a moment when we can intersect with these professionals and make sure they're aware of state goals, they're aware of incentives that the state is offering or utilities are offering, that they are partnered with us so that when Vermonters are trying to figure out how to make whatever their investment is, they have somebody right there who is also knowledgeable about some of the goals we have around our climate crisis. We need to partner with these professionals. And I think maybe you get to a time where you're requiring them to educate people, but at a minimum we need to start immediately making sure these professionals are aware of the programs that are out there, aware of the goals, and aware of the options for Vermonters. And along those lines, real estate appraisers. You may not think real estate appraisers are front and center in the climate crisis, but think about this. Right now they don't have a mechanism to add value because you have a solar array on your roof to the sale price of your house. This is a real problem. This is like nuts and bolts of the economics that are a hangover from the fossil fuel economy. And so we need to put pressure on these folks. We need to partner with them and figure out how you can make sure that we are acknowledging the true costs of our investments and what it means to our economy. That also has an impact in terms of mortgages. And if you can reflect it in a value, then you can start to look at different lending opportunities to make these investments. So there's a whole suite of things around those professionals. Another example is car salespeople. They're not licensed by the state, but they sure are vital to moving people into electric vehicles. And when you walk onto the lot and you've got a checkbook and you know it's going to be a big check, you sure need somebody to say, hey, by the way, did you know this was an option? And BED will do X, Y, and Z for you. And Green Mountain Power will give you this incentive. And the state will give you this tax credit. And the feds will do this. We need to inform professionals all across the state to be partnered with us in this challenge. Next, I want to talk about energy. And Burlington, are most people here from Burlington? Show of hands. So Burlington, we can be very proud of Burlington. Burlington in the 90s invested in efficiency. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, or anybody. I think we put up about $11 million to invest in efficiency, and 5 years later, reduce electric rates. And a few years after that, the state said, boy, that's a good idea, and we created Efficiency Vermont. And we were the first state to create a statewide efficiency utility. And there are now folks at Efficiency Vermont whose job is basically to export this idea, and they travel the country and the world to help people do something similar. Efficiency Vermont has been wildly successful. We are using less electricity in Vermont than we did in 2000 when we started it 19 years ago. And we can be very proud of that. We have a lot of expertise, and most of them down the road just off of Pine Street. However, if you are now looking at making investments in efficiency, and we invest about $60 million as a state every year into Efficiency Vermont, you would not say only work in the electric sector. In fact, you would be foolish to do that, right? We need to move the expertise we have at Efficiency Vermont and get them helping us in fossil fuel efficiency. And we started a process last year to figure out how we would transition Efficiency Vermont into an all-fuels efficiency utility. The Climate Caucus has identified this as extremely promising, and we want to accelerate that transition and get the expertise we already have in state, use the dollars we're already investing into efficiency, potentially grow those dollars, and make sure these folks are homegrown expertise are on the front lines with us as we try to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. So that is efficiency. In energy production itself, we have a so-called renewable energy standard. And that says, crudely, that your Vermont utilities need to have 75% of their power come from renewable sources by 2032. Many of our utilities are already hitting that. It also says, that standard says that 10% of that renewable energy has to be generated in-state. Now, when you generate renewable energy in-state, you are creating jobs, you're creating resiliency. It is a win-win for us, and you are not exporting our energy dollars, right? Because those projects here often are owned by Vermont entities, even some public entities. So what we want to do is push that 75% number up to 100%. And we're exploring how to do that, we're exploring the timeline, but we think our utilities should say 100% of their load is created by renewable projects. And we want to grow the 10% in-state threshold closer to 20. These are, again, creating good jobs. We have actually lost some solar jobs in the last few years. One of the things that's happened 12, 15 years ago when we started down the path of net metering and other things, people didn't know how the market would react. We didn't know how families would react. Legislators said, let's try this. And it exploded. We at one time had the fastest growing renewable energy sector in the country. And you could say it went too far, and so the Public Utility Commission, the legislature, scaled it back a little bit, and we've been trying to balance it out and figure out what is the sweet spot. And I would argue we've come back a little too far, and you're starting to see us lose some steam. We need to make sure that we're keeping those jobs here. You know, these are other examples of jobs like weatherization. You cannot export, you know, solar installation jobs to China. Those are going to be done here by local people, and we need to make those investments. So it is our hope that we can work with our utilities to push it up to 100% renewable and at least 20%, or grow that up to 20% local. If we have 100% renewable and it comes from Hydro-Quebec and offshore wind in Massachusetts, you know, we haven't really accomplished the goals of a resilient, locally controlled grid. We need to pair those two things. Another area here that's exciting, we're trying to figure out exactly the path forward is storage. Green Mountain Power's been investing in batteries, the so-called Tesla wall, is that what it's called? Power wall, so that creates resilience in a household level, and we need to do that sort of in a microgrid level. Our friends down in Heartland, down by White River, had 4 days power outage around the Halloween storm. You know, this is not acceptable. We really should be moving beyond that kind of vulnerability, especially because climate change tells us very plainly we're going to have bigger storms, we're going to have more frequent storms. The impact in Vermont we are seeing is a 7 to 9 inch increase in rainfall every year. And that is pretty predictable at this point. And I will tell you, just on the political side, it's interesting to talk to farmers who you might think of as more conservative and maybe not so interested in this. They'll tell you, oh no, we're dealing with it all the time. What used to be a little swampy area is a full-blown wetland. You know, people are seeing this. But when it comes to energy, it puts onus on us to have as much resilience as we can locally. Lastly, accountability. I think it was, hi Joey, Representative Joey Donovan from Joey, it was 2006 or 7, somebody help me, we put goals in statute around emission reduction. And there were goals, and it was early on in my time in the House, and I was there as a climate activist, and I was excited that we were acknowledging this. And those goals have been basically worth 2 lines that they're printed on in the green books, and we have not done anything effectively to live up to those goals. We have watched them breeze by. That's not acceptable. So when we talk about accountability, sometimes it's called the Global Warming Solutions Act. It has a few planks, and this is what it's trying to do. It starts by immediately putting the Paris goals into law, and in the short term, 2025, around there. When Trump administration signaled they were pulling out of Paris Accord, Governor Scott joined a dozen other governors around the country, said, no, we are going to live up to our agreement. We haven't seen a lot to put a lot of muscle behind that declaration. But it'll be an interesting moment when we say, okay, fine, Paris goals are going to be in law. Then we want to do what Maine and New York have just done in the last few months, and that is not only the Paris goals in the short term, there'll be milestones along the way, but hit a net zero target by 2050. That's what New York did in June. The way you do that, and we're trying to sort this out, is you create some kind of panel of expertise, a balance between the administration and those leaders in the executive branch, citizens, and our in-house or in-state expertise, so that there's accountability. And also, the guts of the accountability comes in a citizen right of action. So if anybody's followed clean water law, the reason that everybody is paying attention to clean water in Lake Champlain right now, and the reason why state is investing up to, I don't know what it is, $50 million a year to clean up the lake, is because a citizen right of action is baked into the Federal Clean Water Act. We want to mirror that. And so it says, not only are we setting out these targets, but if we fall down on those targets, citizens have the right to come together and seek redress through the courts and hold our feet to the fire. And this is important because, it's not enough to want to do things. It's not enough to pass good things we want to do into law. We don't know who the governor is going to be, in 2 years, let alone 15 years. We need a mechanism that allows citizens to hold the state's feet to the fire. And another thing that I like about this is I've never seen a policy that effectively lassos all of state government into this challenge. So if you're Secretary of Education, you're thinking about school budgets and curriculum, you might not think of yourself as being active in the climate crisis. But of course we need Secretary of Education to be thinking about how do we educate our young people so that they're part of these solutions, right? Well, the Global Warming Solutions Act puts pressure on them. It puts pressure on the Commissioner of Buildings and Ground Services. These are the folks that mow the lawn and make sure the windows aren't broken in state government buildings. They also now would be clearly part of making sure our own infrastructure is tight and not leaking and as efficient as possible. The Environmental Review Board, the folks that administer Act 250, you better believe they have a role in the climate crisis in combating that. Global Warming Solutions Act puts its arms around all of state government and says we're headed here, and if we don't head here, the citizens are coming and they're rightly going to say no, you are heading here, you made this promise, we're holding you to it. So that's the suite that we think we can realistically get to the governor this year. That will not be easy. I will say one of the heartening things as we've been doing this over the last 6 weeks around the state is people say, that's all very interesting, how do we help? And you guys are essential. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the legislators here are ready to support this agenda. And even if you're represented by us and you think, oh, my people got it, we need you engaged. We need to hear from people. It helps me to be able to say in committee, I'm hearing from my people that they want this, and they don't want us to back down, when we're pushing to 20% in-state renewable production. I don't want to go back to them and say, we can only get 12. This is where the citizen pressure, somebody said last night, as legislators were getting a little defensive in Bristol, somebody said, well, it's our job to make you uncomfortable. And that's true. We have tried to craft an agenda that we think we can get through the legislature. It is no slam dunk, but we think it is realistic and we hope it will be significant, but it is not it is not a slam dunk. We need people to be active, we need people to speak up, we need people to hold our feet to the fire, and especially reach out to the governor, hold his feet to the fire, and really be engaged with us so that we can get this done. And I think we'll leave it at, we'll leave it there for my presentation, and then are you
I think Mary's gonna
Mary, will you
facilitate our
facilitate our-
conversation, but as